Hello, you're listening to Sending the Experts with Georgina Durrant. This podcast is all about teaching and supporting children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities, SEND. My name is Georgina Durrant. I'm the host of this podcast brought to you by Twinkle SEND. As a former teacher in Senko myself, I wanted to create a platform to share some of the amazing things that my guests are doing to support learners with SEND. So whether you're listening on your commute, tuning in whilst walking your dog, or curled up on the sofa with a nice cup of coffee, thank you so much for joining us. In this episode, I'm genuinely really excited to be joined by Steph Curtis. Steph is a mother of two teenage girls, aged 18 and 16, and she launched her blog, Steph's Two Girls, on the day her younger daughter, Sasha, was diagnosed with autism at the age of 2. Steph's experienced a light bulb moment soon after when she came across descriptions of a specific profile of autism known as Pathological Demand Avoidance, PDA. The features of PDA resonated deeply with her as they accurately characterised her daughter's unique challenges. This discovery served as a catalyst, inspiring Steph to utilise her blog as a wider platform for sharing her family's experiences in order to help others understand more about PDA. And with her newly brilliant published book, PDA in the Family, Steph has shared her family's experiences since the day of diagnosis in the hope that this will help families who are navigating PDA feel less alone. And I know of families that this book is helping, Steph, so I can agree with that. And with unique insights from Sasha's father, sister, it's like the whole family affair, and Sasha herself, this book offers insider knowledge and advice from one family to another and provides a greater understanding for those working with PDA children. Hello, Steph. How are you?
Hi, I'm good, thank you.
Yeah. So let's start with your blog, Steph's Two Girls. I feel like I've been following it almost since the beginning. You're one of those, SEND bloggers that when I started my own one, I was always like in awe of. So you launched your blog on the day that you found out your daughter, Sasha, was diagnosed as autistic. Quite a bold thing to do, just launch a blog. I like the way you've sort of handled this. Can you tell us about that day then?
Yeah, about the blog starting or just about the
I'd like to know about the day, like you finding out she was autistic and then what made you sit down at the computer and start a blog. I'm quite intrigued by that stuff.
It was, it was a bit of a day.
Yeah.
I was there on my own. We'd gone to, I think on my own with Sasha, gone to see a paediatrician after referring Sasha for speech and language therapy about 7 or 8 months previously. So it was the speech and language therapist who then suggested we go see a paediatrician. I was there with Sasha on my own, came home, and I think it was just a way of processing what had gone on in that appointment, because it was all a surprise to me. Obviously, it wasn't a surprise that I was there in the room, but kind of then things sort of in my mind became a bit clearer. It's like the penny dropping. And then, so it was just start the blog and get it off my mind, I think, and I had no clue where it was going to go. Obviously, in the future, it wasn't any big plan. It was just to get some thoughts out of my head.
Yeah, like your little corner of the internet to start with that grew a little bit bigger perhaps than you were expecting.
Yes, it did, yeah.
Do you want to tell us about the blog in general then, so people are aware of it, so they can go and have a look at it?
Yeah, so it's called Steph's Two Girls, which was a name. It's not a great name, really, except for the fact that I do have two girls. So I always introduce myself as Steph with two girls, and they're 18 and 16 now. So I have been doing that blog for 14 years, which is quite a while. But Steph's Two Girls, the name, it was really difficult to find a blog, a website name that wasn't already taken, that didn't have something with mum in or autism or any of that. And I kind of, at the same time, I also knew it was going to, the diagnosis for our youngest would have an impact on our eldest. And I didn't want people to kind of forget that, knock-on effect for the whole family, but particular for our other daughter as well. It's kind of, I think now it's fine, it's fitting, but it's not, it's probably not the first thing that people might think of when it comes to the name. But stephstwogirls.co.uk is what it's been now for a long time.
Oh,
and I'm that on all social media as well, so it does tie in, so that's all fine.
Yeah, no, I think it's catchy, and I love that you've included both girls in that as well. I think that's lovely, that because the siblings often, and I keep meaning to do an episode about siblings, because I think siblings are often not thought about, not by the parents, but just like a second thought, isn't it, when you're thinking about a diagnosis of a special education need and disability. They get overlooked a little bit, unintentionally, obviously.
Yeah.
So tell me about your daughter Sasha, and also what made you realise she was autistic, because there'll be people listening who, we've got an episode on autistic girls, but still it's really important, I think, to go through through that, what was it that made you think she was autistic, or what was it that speech and language therapist noticed that made her think that, or him think that she was autistic?
So it wasn't until that appointment with the paediatrician, autism really had not crossed my mind. We didn't really know anybody who was autistic, we just weren't in that kind of world, or meeting people who are autistic. So it was a complete out of the blue thing when the paediatrician said it. But as I said, about 7 or 8 months previously, we'd referred Sasha to the local speech and language therapy service because she was making a lot of sounds, but her words weren't clear. And she'd mix things up, like pronouns, and there were just kind of some irregularities with the language, and it wasn't clear. And because we had an older daughter who had already been, putting sentences together at that point, we kind of, we thought, well, there's just something, she seemed fine in herself, but, thought maybe that the speech needed some help. Interestingly, though, before that, we had also taken her for hearing tests, which I found out later is very common for a lot of autistic children because it feels like they're not listening to you. Although, as a parent, I used to always say Sasha could hear if we opened a chocolate bar in the next room.
That's so true.
But we'd be sitting there talking to her and it would seem like she wasn't listening to us. But there were no problems with her. Well, minor glue ear, but, no big hearing problems. Yeah. So the speech, it wasn't linked to that either. So it was just a bit of a mystery. We weren't overly concerned, and she was going to nursery, and that was kind of all okay. She was quite sociable, quite happy in herself most of the time. As you'll find out, what I say or what is through a lot of her reports, that she was happy really until she wasn't. Yeah. So it was very one thing or the other, and it didn't always really make sense why she wasn't happy. We couldn't understand it. It was like flicking a light switch. But generally she was a very happy, sociable baby, quite outgoing. Just the speech wasn't clear. So yes, it was the speech therapist who then referred us to the paediatrician. And in that first meeting, the first appointment with a paediatrician, it was quite early in the morning. Well, not super early, but an early morning appointment, and the paediatrician was trying to get Sasha to do something called the Griffiths assessment, which is like for young children that sort of age, and just basic kind of tasks like building blocks in a tower and decreasing size, or putting color blocking, or things in order, or tying shoe, just all sorts of smaller tests. But Sasha was not engaging with many of them, and I kind of thought, yeah, that's sort of what happens at home. If she's not, that's what it seemed like at the time, she's not wanting to do that, she won't. And she was very much like that with the paediatrician as well. So it was difficult for the paediatrician to kind of get conclusive results from the test, if that makes sense. But it was kind of, kind of the penny dropped for me, because I thought this was like when I used to take Sasha to toddler groups, and she didn't sit still and listen to the person in charge. She would run around the room, or she'd be sitting down, but then just suddenly would want to leave. And, there was no keeping her quiet, or, trying to tell her that she needed to stay a bit longer. It was just very definitely she had to go there and then. And I thought, I often made excuses, like I thought Sasha was tired or hungry, and that's why all this was happening. But that morning, there was nothing. She had a great night's sleep. It was an early morning, so there was no reason for her to go and try and lie down in the corner of the room and go to sleep. And that was one of her strategies to try and get out of doing things, was to pretend to fall asleep. She'd kind of curl up into a mushroom, or she'll go hide under a duvet or a coat or whatever. Yeah, that was
Do you reckon having like an old, because she wasn't your first child, do you think that made it a bit easier to notice as well? Because I imagine if you're a first time mum, and you might naively, you'd think it was your own fault, wouldn't you? But I suppose if you've got a child that wasn't doing that to start with, you might have a bit more confidence, as you do when you have more than one child. You have a bit more confidence at your second time round. And imagine people who've got more than two are like, Yeah,
for sure. I've said often before that, I feel we're quite lucky that we had an older daughter. I know everybody says you shouldn't compare children, and they're all individuals, and clearly they are. And, our two girls are very different in lots of ways, but in those kind of responding to the typical parenting strategies, it was clear for us how different Sasha responded. And I think, that's one thing that's kept me blogging, because I understand how difficult it must be for other families when this is your first child and you feel like it's you not doing it right. And obviously I still had some of those thoughts and feelings as well, but I could see that with our eldest that was all going fine, and the way we parented her was fine.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it must be really difficult for parents the first time around who are thinking that and then blaming themselves as well as other people, perhaps thinking it's their fault, which must be really, really difficult. A lot of parent blame. So it's interesting how early she managed to get diagnosed autistic, because looking now, and I know we've had Kathy Wassell on from the Autistic Girls Network, and the huge delays that we know about autism assessments and diagnosis. Do you feel quite lucky how early she was identified? Do you think it was luck of the draw with the speech and language therapist? And
yes, I think she was very good. I think the paediatrician was very good, and they both clearly had that experience and could understand that straight away. But for me, I went home going, well, but to us, Sasha didn't look any different really to the other toddlers. And I knew to, other family members, and wider friends we were meeting, that she just seemed like, a typical toddler really. So, but I was kind of like, but is it really obvious then to other people? And I'm not seeing it, that she is different in some way. But other than the speech, there was nothing really that you could pick out that Sasha was doing differently. So yes, I think we were lucky that we saw good people really early on. I mean, I have to say on the flip side of that, it really does depend on the character. And for Sasha, I think the PDA and the avoiding these demands, not engaging in those ways, what made it more obvious and easily diagnosable, if that makes sense for her. But for our older daughter, she was actually only diagnosed at the age of 16. So for her, complete masking, completely different profile. So I can totally see why it's not seen and understood as much. So
gosh, wow, you've seen like both ends of the spectrum of being able to be diagnosed early and late. Yeah, gosh. That's really interesting. You've flummoxed me a little bit there with that stuff. I wasn't expecting you to say. No, it's
I don't write about our eldest, but she is happy for me to say that is a late diagnosis.
It really is. Gosh. So in the introduction, you mentioned a little bit that you experienced a sort of light bulb moment for Sasha when you heard about PDA, pathological demand avoidance. And we have spoken about it on the podcast, but it was such a well listened to podcast that we definitely need to cover PDA again. And I would, anyone who's listening, if you want to go and listen to the other PDA episode as well, I would recommend it, because that was with the PDA Society. Can you tell us what PDA is for anyone who this is the first, because there will be people listening who don't know what PDA is, and through no fault of their own, it just isn't as widely known as perhaps we'd like it to be. So could you tell us what it is and sort of the characteristics of PDA, how it's different to autism by itself?
Yeah, and that's why, one thing that's kept me blogging, another thing that's kept me blogging is because I just think lots of people haven't heard about this or understood this. And I always say that the PDA Society is the best site for information about pathological demand avoidance. So they're the national charity. So what they say, and bearing in mind, there's still research ongoing, and words change, and all the language around autism has changed massively in those 14 years since I started blogging. So it's still ongoing, but I think there's kind of one way of saying it is that it's an anxiety-driven need for control. And kind of, knock on from that is because if you're in control of something, then you know what's going to happen, and that keeps your anxiety levels low. But there's then others who would say it's a need for autonomy. So there's different ways of saying, some are not so keen on the word pathological. So there's pervasive drive for autonomy, and there's different ways of kind of saying the same thing. But for me, it's these. There were 6. I think there were a couple more, and actually a delayed speech was initially thought to be, part of the group. So it was Elizabeth Newson, who was a British child psychologist, who first recognised that there were a group of children who were behaving, like each other, but in some ways different to other autistic children that they were seeing. And it was her who then came up with the name pathological demand avoidance. And that was in the 80s. So it's still relatively new, really, in terms of, a diagnosis and the sort, and that's why, all the research is ongoing. But the 6 main characteristics now, because they've thought, the delayed speech, although that was one thing, obviously, that stood out to us, that's not necessarily thought to be the same for every PDA person. But so the 6 main characteristics are resisting and avoiding the everyday demands of life. So that means not just the things that are not fun to do or a bit difficult. It means kind of everything. And as I said, for Sasha, it seemed not illogical, but it was just difficult to figure out why, she wouldn't comply with some things. And even things that she wanted to do, like, for example, going swimming, which she loved, she just found it really difficult to leave the house. And there might be other things involved in that as well, but some of that was definitely demand avoidance and putting that on herself. So that's the first one, resisting and avoiding everyday demands, so kind of throughout the day. And then appearing sociable is the next characteristic, but sociable on the surface, but then not really understanding those, the hierarchy and different aspects of sociable. And that could be said for other autistic profiles as well. But back, when I first started writing about it 14 years ago, being sociable was not really seen to be a feature of other autistic profiles. But then the third thing is probably more PDA specific again, is using social strategies to avoid demand. So it's not about just saying no and refusing to do something. It was using other ways. And for our daughter, that might have been putting her hands in her ears and going la la la, so she couldn't hear what someone was asking of her, or repeating back everything we asked her to do. So if we were like, put your shoes on to go out, she would just repeat that back to us, and try and avoid the demand that way. And there was the National Autistic Society actually held a conference about PDA about 10 years ago, and they showed a great video of a boy in a room with a paediatrician, and he was the other side of a table, she was sitting by the computer, and the paediatrician was saying to the boy, can you come over here to do these tests with me? And the little boy, so he must have been probably about 5 or 6 at the time, so a bit older than Sasha was, but his response was, my legs don't work, I can't. So kind of an excuse that didn't really make sense, but to him, he clearly believed that, or believed that he wasn't messing around. It was just that was his way of not having to go over to where she was and do what she wanted. And that my legs don't work just really hit me, because that was the kind of phrase that our daughter would use as well. And as a parent, you just go, but that's, that sounds crazy, but it was, reasonable in her mind, reason for not doing whatever it was. So strategy not to do it. So then the last 3 are excessive mood swings. I've said, kind of everything was fine until it wasn't. So she was always happy, as long as, and this also came up in her reports a lot, as long as she was doing things on her terms or doing things of her own choosing and not what someone else wanted her to do.
The control side of it.
Yes, exactly. So that's, but excessive mood swings. So it would go from like 0 to 100, and all of a sudden, it would be nothing was happening, and we didn't know why. An extreme meltdown. And our daughter actually has only ever, might get back on this later, but she's only ever avoided and withdrawn. So she, as I said, she would do her mushroom shape or hide under a blanket or a desk or whatever. So she wasn't violent or aggressive or kicking off in a big way. She would just, find her own quieter way of not doing things. But, sometimes that would come with a lot of screaming, and certainly, that meltdown could definitely build. So that was that one. The 5th one is about being comfortable with role play, pretend. Having a great imagination, again, is not something that was linked to autistic profiles. Things may be changing, but role play is something that a lot of PDAs use to avoid doing tasks. And you'll hear of children saying that they're a cat, so cats don't do homework, or cats don't sit at the table to eat dinner, but they really believe it. They are acting out that they are a cat, and sometimes this can be for months on end. It can really impact the child. So that's then. And then the last one is about obsessive behavior, which is kind of, or having special interest is one of the main autistic profile traits. But for PDA, as it's said to be more related to generally to people rather than objects. So instead of the typical trains or, random electricity pylons or lifts that autistic children might be seen to be interested in, for PDA, it's more often people. And that can be 2 things, really. It can be the main caregiver. And I think that's because they are understanding and seeing all the little things that make a difference and cause the anxiety. So then, the PDA kind of comes to rely on the main person to understand them. And what is often seen is at school, in a playground, a PDA child might control 1 or 2 or 3 at most, really, a small group of other children, and tell them what to do and what to play. Again, because then they're in control, and that's less, anxiety inducing for them. And that's certainly what our daughter tried to do. But you don't tend to get PDAs, I don't think, trying to control the whole class, maybe, but more commonly we hear of sort of 1 or 2. So it's that kind of control, but not, it's kind of, I always go, it's control because of the anxiety. It's not just for the sake of being in control.
Yeah, and sort of makes the playtimes easier because you're in control of the game and you're in control of what will happen, especially like you say with a small number of people. That's really interesting, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Fascinating. It really is. What do you wish people knew? If there was like, I imagine you wish they knew a lot about PDA, but if you could pick like a couple of things, what do you wish people knew about PDA?
Yes, I've done a blog post that says 10 things you need to know about PDA. But I mean, my first one is always, I want people to know that PDA is very real. I think there's discussion about it. I think, and there's people get sidetracked with other suggestions, such as, that it might be trauma. There's been no trauma, well, say that until school trauma came much later, but, at this stage, there's no kind of family trauma to cause this. PDA is just her profile naturally, or some people might say it's just autism and ADHD together. That doesn't describe our daughter. She's actually not diagnosed with ADHD, but it's just kind of it's a different profile. So I just think trying to explain it or say that PDA is not a thing, doesn't sit right with me, because it has made such a difference knowing about this and understanding about the anxiety and the need for control and all of these approaches that we use that are really important. So I think it always comes back to that, but and then also the general autism thing, that everyone's an individual, and a PDA profile can sort of overlap with the profiles, that you can have a variety of these characteristics. It doesn't need to be one thing or the other. Just for our daughter, this was really clear that all of these were like tick tick tick, and it made sense. So
it must be so difficult, like if you're going through this but people don't understand it and don't believe in it. That must be really, really tough. It must be hard enough for parents who are learning about it themselves perhaps and are trying to support their children as best they possibly can, and I imagine it must be difficult, and then to have people not believe you and believe it's a thing must be it must be
it is,
destroying.
and that's other people's attitudes can make such a big difference in life. And it is living this PDA life or way is we've had to change our whole parenting and the way we do things, which we didn't need to change for our oldest daughter. That was fine. She's done well at school, and all of the typical kind of things work fine for her, but we could just see they didn't for our youngest. So having to change the way we do things and the way we parent was not something we wanted to do or we've done lightly, and it's not easy. It's not an easy choice to do things differently, because there is a lot of expectation and pressure from society. And we've been surrounded by great family and friends, luckily, who have listened to us and read and understood and supported us. But there's lots of families out there who are not, because people are not reading and understanding and just think that there's only one way that things need to be done, and that's not the case. So it's it can be really difficult.
Yeah, absolutely. So why is it then that these sort of typical parenting or teaching strategies don't work for PDA children?
So it does come back to that, the control and they're not understanding kind of hierarchy, and that I think PDAs, they want everything to be fair and just, and they think and believe everybody's kind of on the same level. And certainly we hear a lot, and for our daughter as well, when she walked into that reception class at school, she would quite happily go stand at the front of the class and feel like she was the teacher telling all the children what to do, and she didn't really understand why that wasn't a thing, or that she should also be doing what the other children did. So there was kind of a when she was younger, not really understanding that. But as children get older, it's that wanting that fairness. And I was saying to someone just recently that you have to have a good answer for anything, and you ask why does it matter, why should we all sit at a table to eat dinner, kind of there needs to be a logical response for Sasha to understand and really do that. So
that must get you thinking about things, mustn't it? Like
it totally does.
A lot of the time with kids, you're busy when they're asking you these like really important questions, and you're like, oh, I'm not sure, and you come up with an answer, don't you, just quickly, but you must have to dig deeper and come up with like probably learn quite a lot of things, like why do we sit at the table? Oh yes, I've researched it, I know why now.
Yes, that doesn't mean it's going to happen, because there is then, like I said, there's a lot of anxiety comes into, certain things. There's a lot of other typical autistic issues, so when you're talking about sitting at a table, ARFID, avoidant restrictive food intake disorder, is a big thing for a lot of autistic children. I would say, you know, our daughter has a very restricted diet, but also she's on a very different internal body clock, you know, and her meal times are not our standard meal times, and she doesn't cope well if we were trying to, you know, restrict her to those meal times. So she eats when she needs to, when her body needs to, and you know, the same with sleep. So but like I said, I didn't need to make those changes for our older daughter, but very much so for our younger, because you can just see the results if you don't, and how much, you know, extra anxiety that adds in. And then nothing happens for a day or week or whatever.
Really hard to sort of change your approach and adapt your approach to help. Obviously every parent wants to do the best for the children, so it's the right thing to do, but it must be really tricky to have in your head what you're going, like a plan, and then change that plan, especially when it worked for your eldest. She's almost like evidence of your parenting, isn't she? She's like evidence that it's not you, it is a thing. It's real.
Yeah, I definitely feel lucky in that respect.
Yeah, so how important is the language you use with autistic children with a PDA profile? Because I read on your blog that you try not to use the word no with your daughter.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
And somebody, I think, once translated that and said to me, well, haven't you got any boundaries for her? And I'm like, well, yes, of course we have boundaries, but they're not boundaries like you have to sit at the dinner table and eat tea with us. So, you know, yes, we have reduced demands a lot in our house, and that's what we've needed to do for our daughter. I'm not saying that is necessary for every PDA, but every family kind of needs to find the right balance. You don't take away all demand lightly, you know, it's better to do what you can, but you see kind of a different level of upset maybe. But yeah, so we don't say no, but we might say, instead, you know, when she was younger, we don't, if she says I want to go to the park right now, we don't go, well, no, you can't. We might say, well, that's too difficult today, but you know, maybe we can do it tomorrow or next week or whenever it might be. So kind of, you know, having a reason again for anything is a good idea. But so, and you know, if she was going to be in trouble, she's about to put her hand on a hot stove, then yes, of course, we'd say no, because then in that moment, you know, that is important. Yeah. That's the safety thing. So it's kind of about understanding, what language needs to happen when. But then just more through, you know, had to change through every day our language choice. So instead of saying that, oh, you know, you need to put your shoes on now, you might say, oh, well, it's about time to start getting ready, you know, so nothing, and not saying need or you must or you have to. So no demandy kind of words. A lot more gentle kind of language, which, you know, it wasn't what I was intending to do, and wasn't what I was using for our eldest, but just like, maybe we could do this, or I wonder if, you know, now is the time to do that kind of thing. So a lot of sort of not flowery language, but a bit just gentle.
Just sort of rephrasing it. It makes you think how often as parents we do say the word no as well, because I said it a million times this morning already.
I know.
It's really interesting. Do you find you're using that sort of language in general now as well, like when you
with other people? No, actually I don't think so. I think, you know, we'd probably, and maybe for our eldest now, but you know, that's kind of situational, but not with like my husband or anything. Still talk normally too.
So have you got any other, I suppose you've given us quite a bit of advice on phrasing demands, is there any other ways you can phrase demands to like help learners with a PDA profile, especially perhaps for teachers? Like how
so I mean, so first I'd take a step back and go, well, you know, if you've got demands, what are they, and are they really necessary, and what are you trying to achieve? So it's kind of all of that sort of process comes into it. But using that, I mean, for us and for most PDAs and PDA families I've met, I would say the word fun comes into our life a lot. Fun and novelty, they work really well with PDAs. So using humour, you know, or kind of a slapstick approach, or, you know, I'm so silly I can't find my shoes, or something like that, and trying to, you know, get involved and work alongside rather than it being one person giving a demand to another. I know I appreciate
that hierarchy, then it wouldn't make sense.
I appreciate that's difficult in a classroom situation. It can be. So there's a lot to think about there.
But no, that does make sense though. If they're not seeing the hierarchy, it wouldn't make sense to be telling them, to be told to be doing things all the time and to have all these demands, but to be somebody to work alongside you would make a lot more sense. And I suppose the language they use reflects that. It reduces the demands and makes it easier. So in the episode we had with the PDA Society, they explained the PANDA approach, which is pick battles, anxiety management, negotiation and collaboration, disguise and manage demands, and adaptation. Do you use this approach? Does it help with your daughter?
Yeah, so excuse me. Again, I've done a blog post with and I've called it strategies for PDA, and I've since realised I don't like the word strategies because it does make it sound like we're trying to be a bit crafty about things. And I know that PDA started to change, and use the word approaches, and I've kind of, more recently said ways to help, but so many people just Google still for strategies for PDA. Particularly I think, in education settings, whatever, that's kind of more language that's used. So really it's approaches and how we can change that we should be thinking about, as individuals, and how we work together rather than imposing all these demands. But so I had being flexible was really important. So you say staying on your toes and changing your ideas and not having one set thing in mind, of where you want to go or what you want to do. So that has been really important to me. And sort of building the relationship, and understanding, as I said, that trust relationship is so important. So, it can be based on fun or whatever, but just really understanding everything that's going on. It's, really looking behind the scenes. And then planning ahead. So as with lots of autistic children, having a lot of information is good, but not making it fixed in. That goes back to being flexible. It's not set in stone. But if you're trying to achieve an outing, which I used to do a lot more when our daughter was younger, now she's teenager, she doesn't want to go anywhere, but we used to go. But I'd have, I'd make sure we knew who was going to be there, how long we'd need to be there, how we were getting there. If we had a seat, it always has to be an aisle seat, so we can leave early if we need to. So kind of thinking about every little thing about where we're going was really important. This, I'd say, have a plan A, B, C, and Z, because trying to cover every eventuality. I mean, it has meant as a family we've had to do things, separately at times, and go in two separate cars, so that our older daughter could enjoy whatever show it was. I think we went to see Disney on Ice once, for example, and Sasha only lasted about the first 5 minutes, and then I ended up sitting out in the foyer with her while our eldest enjoyed the show with her dad. So things like that, you just kind of have to be prepared, because there would have been a full-on meltdown if you tried to make Sasha stay there, and it makes no sense to try and make her stay for something that she wasn't enjoying. So you just kind of accept those things. Offering choices is one, I say as well, but not too many, because then that can be quite overwhelming and bring the anxiety levels up. So just trying to have some options, and for them to know what the options are. Language, choosing words carefully is one of mine. Humour, another, and then staying calm, because anytime your anxiety or anger levels rise, that is really picked up. Even the slightest tone of voice change, at bedtime, if I'm really tired and I would go in and talk to Sasha, and I was a bit not exhausted, but just kind of tired, and tired of saying the same thing, or having to do her bedtime routine in exactly the same way, or whatever it was, and she could pick up on that. But also she would sometimes think that my tiredness was anger, and then she'd get really upset, and actually it just made everything much worse. So I had to learn how to kind of totally neutralize all of my sort of emotions whenever I'm trying to, not all of them. And it's good to kind of talk about emotions, but separately, not at a time when it might be an issue. And then so just overall then reducing demands is what we've had to do. Like I say, we haven't done it lightly, but that's
for teachers listening then, who have got a child in their class who has a PDA profile, what would you like them to know about that child? Like, what is it like for that child and obviously it's unique for every child, but in general, what's it like for a child with a PDA profile in school? What are the challenges that they have in school that teachers need to be aware of?
So school's a long story for us, but Sasha was in a mainstream until the age of 10, and then has tried a few different settings. And it's really difficult because her learning, and I would say most PDAs, it comes back to that word autonomous, and it's about what they believe they want to learn. And so having to sit down and take instruction on a curriculum that someone else has decided, the parts of that subject that you need to know, is really difficult. And at some point, they might start to question why and what is the point. And then if you haven't got a good answer for that, you're in trouble. So it's Sasha really struggles to learn anything in typical academic subjects. So her loves now are digital art and animation, and that's really all she wants to know about. So sitting doing classical academic subjects is not going to happen for her. And again, it's the scale. So for other children, it might be fine to a point, but so I'd want teachers to know that a lot of the time is anxiety underlying, and whether that's anxiety of not knowing or not being able to keep up, or just not having an interest in the topic at hand, that might lead to other behaviours that are unwanted in a classroom, for example. But I highly recommend there's 2 books by individuals who've done teaching on PDA. So I highly recommend Laura Kirby and Claire Truman in their books, because they give a lot more strategies. And there's also the main book, I always call it the main book about PDA, which is Understanding Pathological Demand Avoidance Syndrome in Children. Was written many years ago, but there's lots of good strategies in there. And there's also one called Collaborative Approaches. And I appreciate a lot of teachers don't have much time to sit down and read the whole book. Some do, some don't. But there's a lot of stuff out there on the internet as well that is also really helpful. But yeah, it's difficult in that pressured environment. I get that.
So your advice definitely to go and read up on it more, research more, find out more.
And speak to the parents. I know that's a
absolutely
thing to say,
parents
but
are often the experts in they are the experts in their children, aren't they? And they will know what works for them and what doesn't. So working in partnership, I suppose, with the parents is a good idea. So how can teachers help others to understand that strategies to support learners with PDA profile aren't simply just letting them get their own way? Because I think that's a problem.
Yeah, it is. For us, it wasn't so difficult because Sasha was diagnosed so young, and I used to always say as well about Sasha was what you see is what you get. So really, she behaved in school the same way as she did for us at home, as in trying to avoid. But there are PDAs who will mask. It's a social aspect and wanting to fit in as well. So it can be really difficult. But for Sasha, she had a great group of classmates who just accepted her for what she was, who she was, and they didn't really need a lot of instruction in that. It was just instinctive in them. I think it does get a lot more difficult at secondary level for all children, because teenagers are just kind of testing their group abilities and all of that. So yes, they're going to be watching and learning, and that's when I don't know what I'd say informing other students, and that my mind goes back to the image of what is equality, equity, and something else, and they're standing on a box and what you need in terms of support, and explaining that that different individuals need different kind of support and accommodation. So that doesn't mean everyone should have them, although saying that, there's a lot of what you can do to help that could be applied to everyone, and why not? So again, it goes back to questioning why you're expecting certain things to happen. But in the current school education system,
it might not happen yet. What about reward charts and behavior systems based around rewards? Because they don't work. We found when I was speaking to the PDA Society, they were saying that for a lot of PDA, it doesn't work for them. Have you found that as well, and why do you think that is?
Yeah, for sure. And I can give an example of that. But what I would say is there often tends to be a honeymoon period. So it might be interesting because it's a bit novelty to start off with, but it doesn't last very long. So when Sasha went from her mainstream to the next school, a special school, they had a reward system there in place, and it was the children could collect tokens, and then there was a glass cabinet with different kind of toys or whatever, or WH Smith vouchers, a range of things that they could then exchange those vouchers for. And one of the options was to not wear school uniform for a day or a week or whatever. So Sasha initially, for the first couple of weeks, actually did start talk about this and start collecting points, as it were. But very quickly done enough work to kind of get to that reward of not wearing uniform. But then her anxiety meant that she couldn't bring herself to go into school not in uniform, because then she looked different to all the other children. She didn't want that, but she also didn't want any material things. So toys never really been of interest to her, unless they come out of Japan and are rare and are very expensive. But she's not really material in that way. There's certain things, very specific things, but she can't go shopping. Environments outside of the house often are way too much for her, so she's not interested in going and spending money, really, which is a good thing in one way. But there was very little we could buy as a treat or a reward that would work for her, because food difficulties mean you can't just get any old chocolate and sweets. There's very little of that she'll eat as well. So the reward system. So once she realised she'd got that reward but then couldn't do anything with it, then not interested at all anymore in that reward system. You know, if somebody try and say to her, well, do you work and get a point, meant nothing to her.
Yeah. Right, and lastly, because I bet you've been dying to tell us, and we want to know more, and I've read it and it's brilliant, but please tell us about your book, PDA in the Family, which I have read and then I have passed on to somebody else, Steph, and then they've passed on to somebody else. So they should have all bought a book. I apologise.
Oh, well, no, that's fine. I get that. But the more people, it's
well
libraries as well. The more people who read it, the better, whether they're buying it themselves or not. But and it's on audiobook as well, I'll just say. And also I found out on Spotify Premium, if you have that, you can listen to it via that.
Cool. I didn't realise that you could get them on there. That's quite a recent
thing they've started doing. So yeah, and the audiobook, I'll just say we got to record the audio for it as well, which was great. So it's in our voices, or my lovely northern accent, and my husband's, because what's good about the book, or different, I think, is that my husband has written a chapter for the book, and Sasha thinks it's the best chapter, which is a bit unfair, I think, but because he's got a witty way of writing, I would say, and I was writing, the whole story, so it kind of stretches really from when Sasha was a baby, and then, talking about that diagnosis process, and then finding out, the light bulb moment about PDA, and it then talks through, what's happened and other things that have happened around us, such as relationships with other people, and obviously the schooling issues and difficulties there. So it's looking at different aspects of her life across those, about 14 years. Up until she was about 14, I think. So yeah, but his chapter is kind of all of his views on sort of what's gone on in one chapter. So I had to write 12 chapters, and he just wrote one.
He wrote one, and she says it's the best one. That's so unfair.
Yeah, I know, it's very unfair. But I think it's not often that you hear from men in this space. They don't tend to come out and talk about it or share their experiences. So I hope that is helping some other male partners out there. Because I know it's kind of, I don't know if it's wrong to say, but often it is a female caregiver who is at home with children. Not always, but then the people who are not there all the time and not seeing all the little difficulties and building up that picture of why a child is refusing to do something that seems really quite simple, like brushing your teeth, for example. So yeah, but that's the book, really.
And almost like you've got, I imagine, a lot of women are finding it out themselves about PDA and thinking, because they might be the primary caregiver and doing a lot of that, they might find it out first, do some research, all of that, and then they've got to sort of explain it perhaps to their partner, and they could be met with a bit of resistance, being like, oh, maybe have you tried doing this, and which could be really hard. Have you not tried saying this, and have you not done this, and maybe it's because you're doing so and so. And so I suppose for men to see that there's a chapter written for them to access as well, and I'm sure they can access all of it, but having the voice of your husband, I imagine, really does help.
Yeah, I think because a lot of people fight against that, against what society expects, and thinks that you have to kind of uphold all of that. But to hear that other people don't necessarily, and actually things are still okay, is a good thing, I hope.
Yeah, so your book is for families with PDA children, but are you hoping teachers are reading it as well? Is it for everybody?
I do. So there's it's, like I said, it's mostly our story, because I know people often want the advice on how to work or help, and there are other books out there for that, but I just felt I could only write about our experiences. But so I hope through that, sharing our experiences, different examples of what Sasha found difficult and how other people did work with her well, and all of that, and it's not a very highbrow read, hopefully it's quite a quick read, an easy read. So I would love it if more educators read it, and healthcare professionals and everyone. It just gives an example, and again, coming back to the fact that it's real, and this has been our experience from birth. Absolutely. It's not something that's happened later and we're just suddenly turning to this for the reason for behaviours. It was just always there. So
no, definitely, and I would highly recommend it. I've read it and it's brilliant. So last thing, if you could tell us any links, I think you mentioned how to find your blog. We will put, for those people who are listening, if you scroll on your phone down, there'll be some show notes that you'll be able to find links that we're going to mention in a second down there. And also if you're watching on YouTube, down here there should be some links to resources we have on PDA, which we've got in association with the PDA Society on Twinkle, but also we'll put Steph's website and any other links that she's going to tell us now. So what would you like in the show notes below?
Yeah, so the main blog is www.stephs2girls, which is STEHS twogirls.co.uk. So that's the main blog, and then across all social media, so Facebook, Twitter, or X, Instagram, I'm at Steph's Two Girls. And I do actually have a YouTube channel, but I haven't done a lot of video yet.
We might have to tag it in this when it's on YouTube as well.
And TikTok as well. I am on TikTok, but I haven't
Very
used
good.
it that much yet.
I like that you're consistent with your name as well. That makes it a lot easier.
I think it helps. It's not necessarily an obvious name, but consistent.
Thank you so much. It's been so useful. I'm sure our listeners have really, really enjoyed listening and finding out more about your book and about all your experience and understanding and knowledge about PDA. So thank you ever so much for your time, Steph.
Thank you. Lovely to chat with you.
It was so lovely to meet Steph. Wasn't she a brilliant guest? We do have loads of resources on PDA on the Twinkl website, which were created in collaboration with the PDA Society. So do go over, have a look at those. All the links are below in the show notes. If you're listening or if you're on YouTube and you're watching, you can see them below right now. And make sure you're subscribed to our channel. And thanks for listening or watching to Sending the Experts with me, Georgina Durrant.